Welcome to My Therapist Says, an interactive experience enriching your most important relationships. During today's event, I'll be your host and moderator as we present Overcoming Catastrophic Loss. What you're about to view takes place before a live audience and live streaming while offering practical solutions to your relationships. It's like having your own professional Christian mental health provider within the comforts of your living room. During this next segment, relationship specialist will provide you with biblically sound ways in the art of embracing and healthily managing life's catastrophic losses. Specifically, you will learn how to biblically and psychologically deal with the loss of a child, a mate, that precious person who means so much to you, and more. I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Kay Smith, a licensed clinical psychologist. Dr. Smith earned her master's degree in counseling psychology from the University of Southern California and went on to hold administrative and clinical positions in the fields of occupational health, employee assistance, and addictions. She completed her doctoral work in clinical psychology at Azusa Pacific University and joined the student development staff of Point Loma Nazarene University in 2001, where she has served as vice president for student development since 2007. Dr. Smith knows what it means to embrace catastrophic losses. Having lost one son who is now in heaven, she knows as both a psychologist and a faithful believer in Christ how to healthily work through while embracing the loss of a child. Dr. Smith has 3 young adult children and the one son in heaven, and as she says, Mima to a charming grandson. We're privileged. We really are privileged to hear from a godly, Christ-centered believer who has earned respect as a California psychologist. I hope this evening and during this presentation, you will sit back, relax, and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we now connect with a live audience and My Therapist Says. Well, welcome to My Therapist Says, and I want to just do a brief introduction of Dr. Kay Smith, who is our speaker here this evening. I actually knew Dr. Smith before she was a doctor at Point Loma College. We called it Point Loma College back then. It's now Point Loma Nazarene University. And Dr. Smith was an outstanding student as a psychology major and completed that, went on and was serving at a number of prestigious institutions who serve people. I think several of which were nonprofits, serving people and caring for people who would perhaps be the underserved. She also completed her master's degree in counseling psychology at the University of USC, here in the state of California, one of the prestigious universities in the state of California, if not across the United States. She then completed her PsyD, that's a doctorate in psychology, clinical psychology, went on to become and earn the title as a clinical psychologist. She currently serves at Point Loma Nazarene University as a vice president for student development and is really caring for the group of people that are facing some of the greatest challenges. Many of us perhaps listening tonight have a child, a young adult, I guess, who is facing university days or out in the workforce as a young adult. And I believe you have 3 young adult children, and you have the one son who has passed away. And I imagine you'll be referring to that this evening. She also has a grandson who calls her Mima. I believe I have that right. And so we're just delighted. This is Dr. Kay Smith, happens to be, we should say it this way, is Dr. Bruce Smith, our executive pastor, one of our executive pastors, is the spouse to Dr. Kay Smith. So I think I'm introducing it correctly here this evening. And so we're so glad to have you with us. Thank you for being here and being willing to share your experiences, both as a clinician, as a Christian, of course, as a mother, a wife to your husband, a grandmother, and of course, a professional clinician who's helping so many people. So again, would you join me in welcoming Dr. Kay Smith?
Thank you for your kind introduction, Dawn, and it's just good to be with you this evening. It's good to see lots of friendly, familiar faces. I appreciate that. Well, the picture that you can see in front of you was taken on the happiest day of my life, May 17th, 1986, when I married Bruce Smith, 6'7", smart, handsome, funny, and he brought with him 10-year-old Scott, who you see there. Those are my guys. I knew that Bruce would be a great husband because he was a great father, and I had had a chance to see him and the wonderful connection that he had with Scott. They had been abandoned when Scott was 2 years old by Scott's mother, and that had left a deep, deep scar in both of their lives. So when Bruce and I got married, it was a really, really joyful day for us to become a couple, but for the three of us to become a family. And Scott was so excited about having a mom. He had never lived in a home with a mom, and he was really, really excited about that. I know that our topic tonight is overcoming catastrophic loss, but I need to give you just a little bit of context about who we are, a little bit about our story before I get to the loss so that it makes sense. And part of what I would like to say to you tonight is that Bruce and I live our lives before God in as godly a manner as we know how. And He has blessed us tremendously. But part of what I'm going to share with you tonight is really, really messy. And I don't believe comes from any disobedience in our lives. It just comes from the fact that we live in a fallen world, and the sin of this world is messy. And I don't want to sanitize that for us tonight. It would be easy to want to kind of clean that up because we're in church and try to make it sound better than it does. In the middle of that, I want to always testify to God's faithfulness, but part of our story's pretty messy tonight. So we got married in 1986. Just to save you the math, in 13 days from now, we have our 30th anniversary. And God has been gracious, and our marriage has been really, really blessed and a lot of fun. When Scott was 12, we were blessed with a daughter, Lacey. When Scott was 14, we were blessed with another daughter, Shanley. And when Scott was 16, we were blessed with a son, Lincoln, who's actually here tonight. And you see a picture of our family when they're kind of grown up, half grown up. And the younger kids always adored their older brother. Scott was Lacey's first word. She just always adored him. All of the kids really, really adored him. One of the poignant losses for me in losing Scott when we did is that he and Lincoln were just getting to know each other as adults. They're both big guys. Scott was 6'8", Lincoln 6'9", our youngest son. And I have such a clear picture in my mind of the last time that Scott was in our home, and both the boys had just gotten out of bed in the morning, and they were both wearing kind of their pajamas, their sweats, their t-shirts, and they were in the kitchen standing having a conversation, looking eye to eye. And I remember thinking, this is so nice. They get to know each other as adults now, because there was such a big age difference that Lincoln had only really known Scott when he was a child and didn't get to experience much of that time as an adult. So our life went on. We did the things that married people do. Bruce started a business. I was having babies. We continued our education. When Scott left high school, he went into the Army for several years. He got married. Those were really, really good years for him. He had good, stable, productive years when he was in the Army. And then when he left the Army, he struggled quite a bit to find his way forward with a career path. And eventually, he and his wife settled in Klamath Falls, Oregon, on some property that we own there. That's actually where Bruce is right now, preparing that property for sale. And Scott and his wife Colima lived there for a number of years. Scott was, as I said, a big guy. He was musically talented. You see him here playing his guitar. He played in a praise band at church. For a while, he traveled with a Christian band. But underneath the big, fun-loving, talented guy, there was a lot of pain. Some of that I'm really sure was the wounding from being deserted by his mother when he was very, very young. But I think there was also some post-traumatic stress disorder from being in the Army and just some other things that had gone really unaddressed. At a certain point in time, Scott and his wife separated, and she moved out of their home, and we lost contact with her. And then on the night of April 4th, 2013, I was in a hotel room by myself in Kansas City, Missouri. Had just arrived the evening before, traveling with a number of colleagues from Point Loma Nazarene University. We were traveling to a conference, and Bruce called me at 5:30 in the morning, Central Time. I knew that was not good because I knew that was 3:30 in the morning California time. It was the worst phone call I've ever gotten in my life. He spoke slowly, and he said twice, he said, "It's 3:30 in the morning," and my mind was racing. I thought, I know it's 3:30 in the morning. Please tell me what you have to tell me. But he was speaking slowly and deliberately. And he said, "Something terrible has happened to Scott." And my mind raced to our property in Klamath Falls because there's a very dangerous intersection close to our property. And I thought, Scott pulled out and he got hit and he's in the hospital. So my mind was ahead of what Bruce was telling me. And finally, he was able to say, "Something terrible happened to Scott. He died in his sleep." And at that moment, everything just stopped. And I was so aware that I was thousands of miles away from anybody that I knew and that I loved. I wasn't with my husband, I wasn't with my kids, I was alone in a hotel room. And my son had just died. It was a profoundly lonely moment. So we gathered our thoughts, and my second or third thought was, we've got to get to our kids. Two of our kids were living on campus at Point Loma Nazarene University here in San Diego. One was living an hour north. And I knew that with Scott dying in the middle of the night, that there may be things that showed up on social media, and I was horrified to think that my kids could learn that they had lost their brother through social media. So I helped Bruce think of a plan so that he could collect them all first thing in the morning, and he could talk to them personally. That went as well as it possibly could. I quickly made some arrangements for us. I had to travel from Missouri to Klamath Falls. Bruce had to travel from San Diego to Klamath Falls. We finally were able to be together after a really long day at 11 o'clock that night. As it turned out, Scott had lived his last day of life perfectly normally. He was 37 years old. He even talked to a friend on the phone about 9 o'clock that night for about an hour. There was no indication that he would be meeting his maker that night. He went to bed at 11 p.m. and at midnight he stopped breathing and his heart stopped beating. And eventually we learned through an autopsy that he had had a sudden cardiac failure with no previous heart disease that we were aware of, and he never regained consciousness. From the moment that Bruce and I arrived in Klamath Falls, we became aware of one calamity after another. It became clear that Scott's life, Scott was living in a place of darkness at the time that he died. There was a lot of disarray in his life. As I mentioned, he had separated from his wife 4 years before, and unbeknownst to us, he had moved a girlfriend into the home. That created a huge amount of additional emotional distress for everybody involved. And Bruce was the only person who could step into the middle of that and speak wisdom into all the people who were impacted by Scott's loss. The people in his life very quickly kind of lined up behind his wife or behind his girlfriend, and they got into a tug of war, and they were in some respects very uncivil. Into the middle of that, we stepped, and Bruce convened all of the people who were important in Scott's life, and he looked them in the eye and he said, "This is a really difficult situation, and we all loved Scott. We're all in a lot of distress. But every decision that we make, we're going to make to honor Scott." And that became kind of the focal point for every decision that we had to make from that point on. And every time somebody in the midst of the really difficult situation started to kind of spin out of control, we would bring them back to help them get their feet on the ground by reminding them that everything we do, everything we did, every decision we made was to honor Scott. And that really enabled all of us to get through a really dark, really, really awful time. So that's our context. And I wish that I could tell you that there was sweetness and light and joy in the next 2 or 3 weeks, because it's not true. It just wasn't true. It was awful. Not only did we lose our son, but once we stepped into the reality of what had been his life, it was really, really profoundly messy in ways that we had no understanding of, but we still had to navigate, and we were the only ones who could navigate them. So if you want to look at your outline at this point, in preparing for this evening, I tried to think, what did we do that helped us navigate? And anything that I share with you that makes it sound like there was a formula, or right after we lost Scott, we were clever enough to sit down and say A, B, C, and D, it's not true. It's absolutely not true. What I'm going to share with you now is retrospective. It's 3 years. We marked the 3-year loss of Scott this last April the 4th, just last month. And so I now have 3 years, and I looked back and I made note of those things that were helpful to us. And some of the things we did, and I'm going to share those with you, but many of the things that helped us cope were things that other people did for us, things that we weren't even clever enough to ask for or know that we needed. And other people were just sensitive, I'm sure, to the leading of the Holy Spirit, and probably just had more knowledge of loss in their own lives and reached out to us in meaningful ways. So some of the things that we did, the first thing that I mentioned, every decision that we made in the midst of those dark, dark days, we made with a goal of honoring Scott, and that helped us stay focused. I even wrote his obituary for the newspaper. I just want you to know that that's a lousy thing to have to do. But in that obituary, I had to acknowledge a wife and a girlfriend. That is a really lousy thing to have to do. But we did what had to be done to honor Scott, and I think we did really well at that. Bruce and I selectively gave up our rights. Bruce particularly, if there was anybody in the middle of this situation who had rights, he had rights. He had been a single parent for years. He had done the night feedings. He had nursed Scott through those early years when they didn't have a wife and a mother. Bruce had rights, and he laid them aside, and he honored other people who loved Scott as well. I would just say, I never thought of myself as Scott's stepmother, and that wasn't the way that our family lived. But the truth is, I was Scott's stepmother, and so in the middle of that time, I stepped back and I let his mother step into that place of honor. So those are the kinds of things I mean when I say that we gave up our rights. It really called forth from us wisdom and discernment and maturity. I think all of us have had the experience that when we're under pressure, when we're under stress or duress, we're not our best self. And I can certainly attest to that. I can be short-tempered or flighty, but God really gave us the grace to keep our feet on the ground, to stay grounded, and I think to exercise particular wisdom and discernment in those really dark days. Bruce and I have a pattern in our marriage of having devotions together in the morning when our schedule permits. So in our regular life, it's about 3 mornings a week that we're able to do that. And in those first 2 weeks after Scott died, when we were together every day, we had our devotions every day as a matter of routine. And we read Psalm 37 together every single morning. At a certain point, one of us said to the other, "Where did we get Psalm 37? Why Psalm 37?" And neither one of us has a memory as to how or why we chose the Psalm 37. So it's possible God just chose it for us, but it was really meaningful for us. And I'm going to share just a few verses with you. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil. It's a much longer psalm, and I commend it to you, but it was very, very meaningful to us in those days, and we read it and shared it every day. Another thing that was really helpful to us as we walked through particularly those first 2 weeks, there were times we knew that we were going into a particularly difficult conversation or decision that had to be made. And when we could anticipate that, we stopped and we prayed. We prayed out loud. We stopped and we prayed together before we went into those conversations. And I have to say that every single one of those conversations went as well as it could have gone. And I'm remarkably thankful for that. for months after we lost Scott, we were just extra gentle and extra tender with each other. We didn't put on kind of the daily expectations and demands that we often insert into our marriages. We were just extra tender and extra gentle. We especially honored our marriage and loved on our younger kids. Bruce and I were privileged to be part of large, caring communities as part of our employment. Bruce, as Don mentioned, is a pastor here at Skyline. He had been here for many years at that time. I had been for many years at Point Loma Nazarene University. And so we were receiving rich support in those places. And what I realized within the first month after we lost Scott, our young adult children, who are 20, 22, and 24 when their brother died, their friends moved in really close and left really fast. When you're in your early 20s, you're easily distracted and you have lots of very important things to do, like going to school and work and what have you. And I do not mean to disrespect their friends, but I realized sometime in that first month how it was just kind of that deer in the headlights look I saw in the eyes of our younger kids, because they didn't have that rich community reaching out to them like Bruce and I did. And so we made an extra effort to hold them close and love on them. Sometime in the first few weeks after Bruce and I were back at the office and back in a routine, and we looked more normal than we felt, I came home one evening and I said to Bruce, I don't know what to say when people say, "How are you?" I really don't know what to say. I look normal. I got up this morning, I had my coffee, I went to work, I'm doing the things you have to do in life, but I feel so not normal. Things are so amiss. I don't know what to say. And at that moment, I realized I made a connection with an earlier time in my life. My family, the family I grew up in, lived in southern Africa for a year when I was 12 and 13. And it was the custom of the people in our area, if they lost a spouse, in honor of their spouse and in honor of their grief, they would dress entirely in black for a full year. They would be in mourning in that visible way for a full year. And there was a widow in our church who was in the middle of a season of mourning when we were there. And I remember thinking as a 12-year-old, that's so silly. A whole year. She's going to dress like that for a whole year. That came back to me when I was talking to Bruce about what do I say to people when they ask me how I am, and I realized how I wished that in our culture we had some symbol so that people would just know when they saw you, oh, he's in a season of loss. She's in a season of grief. They would just know, and they might not even ask, how are you? They might just come up and pat you on the back. Or we don't have anything similar to that. Around the time that I was having those thoughts, Vicki Trask, who attends Skyline, had lost her daughter 2.5 years prior to us losing Scott. And she met me outside of Skyline one evening after an event, and she waved at me, and I was talking to somebody, and I said, I can't talk to you right now, Vicki, because you're going to make me cry. I knew that when I would talk with another mother who was bereaved, that it would be really heartfelt. And so I finished my social conversation, and she and I went over in a corner, and she had a book about heaven with really beautiful pictures of what we think heaven might look like, and she gave that to me. and she gave me a necklace. It was a very simple necklace. It was a silver rose, not really much to look at. And she said, "This rose is only worn by mothers who've lost a child, and you keep it as long as you need it, and then you give it to another mother who's lost a child when you're ready to do that." And I really needed that. I wore that every single day for the entire first year until we marked the first year of Scott's loss. I needed a visible symbol and representation. Even though not everybody knew what it was, I knew what it was, and it was a way to kind of mark that deep, deep, abiding grief that you have early on. Then when we were approaching the first anniversary of Scott's loss, I felt like we need to do something. So I asked every member of the family, what should we do? And every single one of them got kind of that deer in the headlight look, and they said, "I don't know." And I just felt like we had to do something. Scott loved the ocean. He loved the ocean, and he loved to fish. So I got everybody together, and we went to the ocean. Oh, I know what we did first. He loved coffee. So the first year, we went to a coffee shop, and we had a cup of coffee. And then we went to the ocean, and we ate seafood right on the ocean. And then we went home, and we just sat around, and we talked about Scott, and it was good for us. And then the second year, we had breakfast at the ocean. And then the third year, which was just a very few weeks ago, all of us who were here, we had a daughter who was living abroad at that time, all went to the ocean and had a meal. So it's been good for us to just mark that anniversary, mark that time. It's been good for us to be together on that anniversary. How others supported us. Scott died in Klamath Falls, Oregon, and Bruce and I had lived there. Our whole family had lived there 20 years earlier. And we had been involved in the Klamath Falls Church of the Nazarene. So there was several pastors later by the time Scott died. It was not his church. And there were people at the church who knew us. Part of what I'm saying is that church didn't owe us anything. We showed up in crisis, and they threw their arms around us. They opened their facility to us. They hosted a meal for us. They gave us their technology. They were just deeply, deeply Christian in their response to us. I was so moved by their care for us as fellow believers that at the end of the meal, I went over to talk to one of the women in the church. You know how sometimes at a church there's a group of women who kind of take over the kitchen, and they bring out the water and they clear the dishes. I grew up with a mother who's committed to that kind of ministry, so I know that ministry really well. And I was so touched that those women had come out. I had never even met them. They didn't know our son. They could have just let us do all those things ourselves, and yet they had come out and done those small things. And I went over to one of those women and I said, "Thank you so much. This means so much to us." And she looked at me and she said, "You would do the same thing for me." That was a huge lesson. Because someday I will do the same thing for somebody else who's walking through grief, and I have no personal relationship with them. And I will do it because God is among us and between us and works in and through us. Our pastor here at Skyline flew up to Klamath Falls and he preached Scott's service. That may not sound like a really big deal, but his wife was dying. And in fact, she passed less than 3 weeks after Scott died. So it was a really, really big deal that he was willing to do that for us. I shared with you that when Scott died, his life was really, really messy. That was a place of deep, deep distress for Bruce and I, because as Christians, we had questions about where he would spend eternity. And one of the ways in which Pastor Jim ministered to us in a way that was so meaningful, Bruce was talking to him about our deep, deep anguish about where Scott would spend eternity. And Pastor Jim said to him, can you just now, just place him in the hands of a loving God? So whenever those questions come up for me, whenever they come up for us, that's where I go with that. We place him in the hands of a loving God. So much bigger, so much greater, who reaches into the deep, deep pain of our lives. Bruce and I don't fully understand the kind of darkness that Scott was living in at the time he died. But God knows what that darkness was about. And God entered into that darkness and that brokenness with Scott. And I believe that God was so present with Scott at the time that his heart stopped beating. So even today, we place him in the hands of a loving God. The cards and the flowers that were sent to us were really, really meaningful. I know they seem like simple expressions, and we couldn't really take them in the moment. But later on, after things were quieter and we were through that initial season of distress, it was really wonderful to open the cards and to envision the faces of the people who had reached out to us in that time. As we were making our way back from Klamath Falls, one of my coworkers, he and his wife actually drove an hour to our home to get there before we did, and they left a live apple tree on our front porch with a card. It was so meaningful. It was just that sense of hope for tomorrow. They know that we grow things at our home. And so we go out now and we look at Scott's apple tree, and it's 3 years bigger than it was 3 years ago, but that was such a meaningful gift. A couple nights after we got home, two of my cousins, one is here tonight, sent us dinner, a honey-baked ham dinner. It came in a huge box, and we opened it, and it had the ham, and it had all the side dishes, and they were all chilled. All you had to do was heat it. And I know that sounds really simple, but we hadn't been home for 3 weeks. We didn't have any food, and we had these other very large, very hungry children. And it was so nice to sit around the table and have a nice meal to be able to share. And that was really meaningful for us. When I returned to work, it's very strange to go from that place of loss and grief. It's a very personal place, and then to have to shift gears and go back into a workplace. I was kind of apprehensive about that. I work with some wonderful, wonderful people. They knew the day that I was coming back, and when I had to walk through several people to get to my office. They were all just really quiet. They, kind of nodded. They gave me a lot of space. When I got into my office, they had put together a box of just thoughtful things. Cards, remembrances, little smooth stones with scripture verses on them. A small bouquet of flowers. They were just small, thoughtful, precious things. It gave me several moments to just kind of collect myself and to kind of build that bridge between that very personal space of grief and loss and coming back and reconnecting with that larger world. And then I've already mentioned that it has been meaningful for us to remember the anniversary of Scott's passing. And I have a few people in my life who obviously have it on their Outlook calendar. And on the anniversary of Scott's passing, I just get a little email that says, "We're thinking about you today. I know that you had that loss." That's really, really meaningful that somebody else remembers and somebody else goes to that little bit of extra effort. So those are the things I wanted to share with you, some of which we sort of created ourselves and they were helpful to us, and then many, many things where we felt so supported by the family of God. If you're as old as I am and you remember Bill and Gloria Gaither, you will remember a song, "I'm So Glad I'm a Part of the Family of God," and that the words of that song became really meaningful to me in the ways that we were cared for. Such tangible, precious ways by the family of God.
Thank you. Yeah, normally we clap, and I think we're all so moved. I have never experienced this sanctuary being this quiet. So you really have moved our hearts by how God has moved in your life and your life as a family. May I begin with a couple questions? We don't have any questions yet. I think this is a very different setting tonight than you're sharing a personal story that I'm so thankful that there are others even outside of this building who are listening to how you and Bruce and your precious children and grandson and family have moved through this. Could you tell us, as others might have questions, there's some people raising their hand with the card, so if you have your 3x5 card and would like to ask a question or a response, or it may pertain certainly to your life. That's the idea of My Therapist Says. Dr. Smith, K. Smith, was so kind enough to be here this evening. I cannot think of how courageous it must be to share your story. So I don't want to presume that I believe I know what that would be like. But I deeply thank you for your willingness to be so candid and so open. That's why we're all just so attentive here, obviously, listening to you. So if you have a question, I know some questions are coming forward, but I would like to start with, would you be able to talk just a little bit about your husband's experience? And you shared quite a bit. So it sounds as though I may not have heard that, but you shared quite a bit. And how someone of his caliber coming back as a pastor where he's continuously giving, and how he came back into an environment, and then even where he is today. The timing was obviously perfect for him to be there, you to be here today, and he may be listening in as we are here this evening, and he's in Oregon, perhaps listening in. Just a little bit more about, if you could, Bruce Smith. So many of us, at least in this congregation, and many here tonight, have been ministered to thoroughly by your husband and his gifting of giving to others. Just your thoughts about how do you face this on a daily basis now? And I just was wondering just if it's okay. I should have asked Bruce permission. Is it okay, Bruce? He's listening in. I think he said yes, so I think we can move forward a little bit. I'll ask for forgiveness later. But Just your thoughts as his precious wife and your love for each other.
Sure. So I guess I would say a couple of things. At the time that Scott died, Bruce was very, very ill. He was ill for a period of 13 months with an undiagnosed illness. At that time, he was losing a pound a week, and he was really sick. And so that compounded the time that we lost Scott, because honestly, we were in the middle of a season where we thought he might be terminally ill. And you don't, as you would know, you don't, run around and talk about those things.
Right.
But it was the reality of our life. And it was several months after we lost Scott that we finally got a diagnosis and we finally got medical treatment that has stabilized him. So the early days were dark, dark days on multiple levels. Since Scott lived in our property and he had passed away and his girlfriend was there, that made things very complicated for us. And she left after a period of time, and we were very thankful for that. But that necessitated then us sort of reclaiming our property. And the process of reclaiming the property was part of where we really realized how dark Scott's life was at the time that he died, when we entered into the condition of the property. There were some men here from Skyline who spent between 2 and 3 weeks with Bruce up on the property, literally reclaiming it and just bringing health back to it. And praying over the property. That was a great gift to him, specifically. That was an area that I couldn't help with. I couldn't enter into, and so that was a great gift to him. As far as now, the phrase that comes to my mind is that phrase from AA, one day at a time.
Okay.
You take it one day at a time. And he is up there by himself this week. And so the conversations we're having in the evening are hard conversations right now. If we had been clever, we would have just fixed the house up and sold it right after Scott died. But we couldn't do that. We needed that place a while longer. And so it's been 3 years, and we need to let it go now. And so that's what we're doing. He's up there preparing it so that we can let it go.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, there's questions that are coming forth, and thank you again, and thank Bruce for both of your openness in this dialogue and this conversation. This relates a bit to what you're talking about, and this particular individual is asking the question, I lost my 20-year-old son 2 years ago. So this is a very young adult. And my grief has developed into anxiety. What steps can I take to start to heal? I feel like I'm in a tailspin of emotions. So the question again, I lost my 20-year-old son 2 years ago. My grief has developed into anxiety. What steps can I take to start to heal? I feel like I'm in a tailspin of emotions. Would it be possible, Dr. Smith, to first tell us what are kind of the steps of grief? And then we can try to respond to this person who's really just beginning in this very, very challenging, this loss of her precious, or this person's precious son.
Well, first of all, I just want to tell you that my heart breaks for you. Just breaks for you, because it's awful. Sometimes as Christians, we want to get to the silver lining a little too quickly. So I just want to tell you that I'm sorry, and my heart breaks for you, and it hurts like crazy, and it doesn't heal overnight. There are steps of grief, and I'm not sure I could call all 5 of them for you right now. Denial and anger, and finally you get all the way through and you get to acceptance, and they all sound a little too clinical and a little too trite when you're in the middle of it. Experiencing a lot of anxiety and being in a tailspin, I could appreciate that you would find yourself there. So I will make a couple of comments, and you may have a couple of comments that you want to make too, Don. I would think about seeking professional help, either through a grief recovery group or a Christian therapist who works with grief. Sometimes there's a place for medication on a transitional basis, especially with anxiety, to tone that down a little bit so that you can catch your breath and develop some new patterns of living. Connecting with a supportive community, like a small group where you could really share your heart. I think the healing and the recalibration comes so incrementally. It doesn't happen overnight. And that's why I wanted to be sure that even though I said I put a few things down on a piece of paper, I could only put them down because I looked back at them. I didn't have a recipe that I was following. And if you've been through loss, or you know that there isn't a formula to follow, and the healing comes a little bit at a time.
Yes. A person asked the question, I'm not leaving this question, but another person asked, do you feel any joy as you used to feel joy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
It took a while. Our anniversary is just like 5 weeks after the anniversary of Scott's death, and the first anniversary after we lost Scott was a very strange anniversary. We did the things you're supposed to do. We got dressed up. We went out to dinner, but it felt very strange. Like, are we allowed to feel joy? But yeah, I do.
So part of it is, Kay, is the ability to actually do the traditional or mundane, even the simple things that you used to. Because it can sound like, as you heard the words, I mean, it was so quiet in here, when your husband was sharing with you about this, there's no word to express it, horrific, catastrophic loss, that everything stopped. I think you said it stopped, and there's a tendency in grief, if I'm correct, is there's a tendency for the world to feel like everybody else is moving, but you've stopped. Sort of like a commercial where they speed everybody up and they're walking or running fast, and you're just standing there watching it. It's as if the world is going by and everything is slow motion. In fact, you said your husband spoke very slow. I don't know if you used the word deliberately, but very slow. And so maybe doing things that may sound too simple or mundane, that would be, even if you did not have something in the morning to do for whatever reason, maybe you were off that day, or perhaps you're home working and you find yourself with anxiety, depression. Keep in mind that if you have anxiety, this goes back to the question, we typically have some level of depression. Depression and anxiety tend to coexist. They tend to work off each other. So what you might be able to do is just maybe make a note of what you're going to do the next day. A simple note that I'm going to, at 8 o'clock, I'm actually going to get out of bed. I'm going to make my bed at about 8:15. I'm going to take a shower. And then I'm going to fix maybe the coffee, get a cup of coffee. But doing something very simple, because you will possibly not feel like doing so. In fact, your last words there indicated that you were doing something you had done before, but it felt very different. So would you say that's helpful to maybe be able to do simple things that one used to do.
I would say that's really helpful.
Yes.
Routine. I think that's one of the routine is healing.
Yes.
It does give you some structure.
And we heal with others, but yet with catastrophic loss, we don't feel like being with others typically, maybe with our own family. But there's a tendency, I think it was Carl Menninger, he wrote a very famous book in 1969, Whatever Happened to Sin, but in his writings, he talked about depression and anxiety, and he said, if you're depressed, quote, lock up your doors, go across the tracks, and do something for somebody, unquote. The idea is that's not a simple accomplishment unless maybe we plan that and try to do some very simple things. In fact, this next question ties into this. And that next question is, and we did not fully answer that question with the person who expressed this loss. I might add this, as a clinician and now 30 years working with people with loss and catastrophic issues, that one of the gravest losses that there will ever be on this planet is to have a child who passes before you do. There's serious research that shows this, that it was never meant to be that way. And those of us who have been privileged to have children, adopted children or biological children, adopting them, that we know we could, the way God made us, we could stand in harm's way for them. So when they face ultimate harm, something within us drastically changes. I wanted to say, but I kept myself from saying, something within us dies. And so this is really a catastrophic loss. Probably wasn't the best term, overcoming, because we try to move through it and live with it and try to work with it. But this question asked, my sister, okay, she's saying, my sister has terminal cancer. What can I do to help her family prepare for her death? Now, if I can digress back just for a moment, the question, my sister has terminal cancer. What can I do to help her family prepare for her death? I had not put together what you had said. I knew Bruce was ill, and yet I just thought when you were sharing, prior to losing your son, you were in the stages of potentially losing your own husband. Mm-hmm. So the severity of this is beyond words.
At the time, it felt that way.
Of course, he's past that now. We know that there's been a...
But in the middle of it...
Oh, my goodness.
We didn't know. We just didn't know.
Yeah.
It was... Yeah.
Yes.
Overwhelming.
Overwhelming, yes.
Yeah.
So how could we help someone? This really relates, actually, the questions all relate to probably most of us in some life situation. One of my dear friends, Dennis Apple, was one of my pastors at College Church of the Nazarene. And he's given me permission to share this because I asked him a long time ago. But he came home one night and his son, who was heading for medical school, somehow wasn't able to breathe. He was just on the couch and he choked to death. And we just couldn't believe it. And I rushed over there and his son is dead on the couch. And I just grabbed Dennis and I just grabbed him. Oh. And he looked at me and he said, this can't be true, Don. It can't be true. And I'll never forget him years later. We were standing on a street corner in Olathe, Kansas, and I know you've been in that area. You were back in Kansas City not long ago. And he looked at me and he said, Don, you see all of these houses? I said, yeah, Dennis. He said, every one of these homes, if people live long enough, will have some major loss. I'll never forget his empathic heart for those who have loss. And this one is asking the question, my sister has terminal cancer. What can I do to help her family prepare for her death? What would you suggest? Maybe we could talk back and forth a little bit and try to respond to this. You actually faced that. Fortunately, it did not happen. It wasn't cancer, of course, but...
I lost my closest lifelong friend to cancer 13 years ago now, number of years ago. And we knew she was going to pass. And so the last time I visited with her, I sat with her. She had asked me to do her eulogy. So I sat with her and I fact-checked everything. Your sister was born in what year? And, it's kind of a strange thing to do. But we actually talked about those things that were important to her and the family that she was leaving behind. Her parents were going to celebrate their 50th anniversary a year after she died. And so she had actually set some money aside for their 50th anniversary, and she had appointed somebody to put that together for them. She and I lived in different states. And she had some clothes set aside for a sister and some clothes set aside for a mom. And she had a ring that she gave me and a ring for her daughter-in-law. So she had done those things, and she shared that with me so that I could then share those things with family members after she passed. If I were thinking about this question, I would think about sitting with my sister and saying, how can I help you? What can I do for you
So be assertive
after you're gone?
Yeah, being assertive that, maybe move forward and
ask.
And ask.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're afraid to ask because we feel that might hurt the person, right?
It's really frightening, isn't it? It's frightening to literally talk about one's own or the death of someone that you love. It was a very strange thing when I sat with my friend and we were writing her eulogy. It was very strange.
Yeah. This question, I wanted to pass this to you because it's someone who knows you. We normally don't say names, so I'm not suggesting you would say the name of the person. But this person wrote a question because we're actually videotaping this and it's live streaming. So if you'd like to at least read the question, we don't have to engage the person necessarily, but...
Well, my cousin wrote this.
Okay.
And he loves me. Let's see. Tell us how we can continue to speak of the missing without hurting or opening wounds of the family present. Their impact goes on. It's probably different for every family. We love to talk about Scott. Scott never lived with us in San Diego, so there aren't that many people in San Diego who knew him. There's a few, but not that many. So there aren't people who can say, oh, I remember when I was at that barbecue at your house and Scott did his famous tri-tip. So we have to go other places to have those conversations. But we love to talk about Scott. I think this question perhaps gets complicated if there's loss and remarriage and what have you, and sometimes emotions get complex, and it makes it more difficult to talk about a loved one when there are new loved ones present. And those are probably situations we just have to be sensitive about.
So it would not maybe be hurtful to even ask, would it be possible if we talk about this? You could ask an invitational question and the other person could say, I'd prefer not to. Sometimes it's difficult to be assertive because we believe we're being aggressive. But it could be just to ask, what would be helpful? What could I do? You mentioned something that in the church, having performed many funerals over the years, I had a little boy that had died and people were coming by, and of course I'm standing with the family, and one person quoted scripture to the father who was standing with his boy dead. And I'm not a rageful person, but I felt like I wanted to take the person aside and scold them for saying it's so painful. I think they were trying to do the right thing, like God's going to work good, Romans 8, in this. Yet, how is it good right now with his boy dead right there? It doesn't look very good. And so sometimes we can use platitudes rather than being present. I noticed you said someone came up and just put their arm around you. Didn't say a word. When I sat with Dennis Apple and his son, I had nothing to say at that moment. Right around the corner, his son is still dead. Although later we had a lot of time to talk. But sometimes, even though we know Scripture's so helpful, so rich, so full, and it's alive and it's helpful, in the moment when we are deeply, deeply wounded, even though that wound will always be there, we will work with it differently. It's important when we're helping people to be invitational. Would it be possible? What would you prefer? We have some food here. Would that be helpful? Or would you like for us to take the food home that we're bringing to you? Or like you had friends that delivered that apple tree, and that's so special. And obviously those friends knew you and Bruce and your family well and were able to appropriately respond at that moment. Being gentle, I guess I was trying to suggest.
Being gentle, being present, not feeling like you have to have answers.
Right.
Just care.
Mm-hmm.
Presence was very meaningful to us.
Yes. Yeah. It's sort of like, and I know we're going to have to wind down, have you ever had a friend that just sat and listened to you? They didn't say a word, and then you responded. I have had this experience, I have before. And I go, thanks so much. Thank you for listening to me. And the person smiles and says, I didn't say a word. And the whole point was they were just present. And think about the Holy Spirit being 24/7 present with you, willing to listen to every thought, word, emotion. That's the Comforter. That's why we say the Comforter has come, because he can live within us. But thank you. I want to thank you so much for you being willing to share your story. This has moved us in a way, and others who've listened from live streaming in ways that will be ever changed. And I want to thank Dr. Bruce Smith. I imagine he's listening tonight as well, listening to as you present, or he'll be able to see it later. But thank you again. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Kay Smith for her presentation? Thank you. We are now in the teens of over 100 and almost 10 presentations over these 9 years. With My Therapist Says, we have DVD, or actually videos of the presentation since this sanctuary was built several years ago. And we're just so thankful for people like Dr. Kay Smith and others who are able to be with us and share their expertise, but also from a personal level. I've always said this about therapists, and I have some that I work with on a daily basis, and I know you're a professional therapist, professional clinical psychologist, that oftentimes when people have great skill and they combine that with great openness and vulnerability, it's a great gift to us, and that's what you've given to us tonight, Dr. Smith. I want to invite you that the next My Therapist Says, we are privileged to have one of the premier thinkers, researchers, and thinker in this particular area of stabilizing your child's chaos. Dr. Joe Price, is one of our very own here at Skyline Church. He happens to be a professor of psychology, child development at San Diego State University, and he is an expert in adoption and care for children. Actually, my wife, Robin, and I have consulted with him and his wife, Sherry, both of whom have raised beautiful children, and we find them as having great expertise in parenting, and he also has the credentials to show it. So he's going to be with us on June 7 for our next My Therapist Says. If you have any children, grandchildren, or children in your neighborhood that you have an influence on, and by the way, you have an influence on children more than you believe. And so I hope you will be here for that. That's Tuesday, June 7, 6:45 in this particular auditorium. And as well, the following 6 months, beginning in August through December, we are going to have Dr. David Levy. He's a medical doctor, neurosurgeon. He and I are going to be hosting a 6-month series on emotion, the body, and sexuality, as we look at these very critical components of who we are. So I'm so pleased to pre-announce that coming up. with Dr. David Levy. So we're going to have a word of prayer, and then we'll close for the evening. Thank you so much for coming. And again, Dr. Smith, thank you so kindly for your contributions to us. Father in heaven, we thank you that you are not there. You are in heaven, but you live within us. Thank you for that. And thank you for your grace that you have shared this evening. Any truth comes from your heart. Thank you for science that explores and helps us to understand that truth. Thank you for theology that is also attempting to understand you. Thank you that we cannot fully know the mind of God because you're God. We would be God, but we can fully know the heart. The heart is that full of compassion and love for us. So we thank you, and we thank you for Jesus, who was a man who faced a lot of pain. And he was fully man, fully God. And thank you, Father, for this gift to us. And so we thank you for your presence. Go with us now. We give you praise. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. God bless you. I hope you have a tremendous evening. Thank you for coming.